very, very early on the Wednesday morning between the death and the funeral. And I just sat down and wrote it, and it took about an hour and a half, and just came pouring out, really. Actually, it's interesting. Sounds rather sort of bizarre, but I did go to Diana's coffin the day after I'd written it. And
there is a man in England who has not given a single interview about Diana in nearly 3 decades. Not one. In a world where everyone who once stood within 10 feet of the Princess of Wales has written a memoir, launched a podcast, or sold their story to a streaming platform, this man has remained completely, almost defiantly, silent. His name is Charles Spencer, the 9th Earl Spencer, Diana's youngest brother, and the fact that you may have nearly forgotten he exists is, as you are about to discover, entirely intentional. Because silence, for Charles Spencer, is not absence, it is armor. It is a decision made in grief, renewed every single year since a September morning in 1997, when he walked into Westminster Abbey and said words that shook the entire world. And now, in the early months of 2026, that armor has been tested in a way nobody inside the Sussex media operation apparently anticipated. The result of that test is 4 words that may have just changed everything. Tonight, we are going to walk through all of it. Who Charles Spencer actually is, why his silence has meant so much for so long, what was reportedly put in front of him in 2026, why he responded the way he did, and what that response signals about the direction of one of the most complicated family dramas of our time. Let us start where everything involving Diana always starts with a moment so charged that it burned itself permanently into collective memory. Westminster Abbey, September 6th, 1997, the funeral of Diana, Princess of Wales. A global television audience estimated at over 2 billion people watched a young man in a dark suit take his place at the lectern. He was 33 years old. His sister had been dead for 6 days, and what he delivered was not a eulogy in any conventional sense. It was a declaration. It was an indictment. And for roughly 8 minutes, it was the most honest thing that had been said publicly about the royal family in living memory. He spoke of Diana's warmth and her complexity. He spoke of the cruelty of intrusive lenses that had stalked her. He made a promise, and the word promise matters enormously here, that Diana's sons, William and Harry, would be shielded from cold institutional forces, that the Spencer blood family would stand as a barrier between those boys and the kind of emotional rigidity that had, in his view, caused their mother so much suffering. He said all of this while the Queen sat feet away, while Prince Philip sat feet away, while the future king sat feet away. He did not lower his voice. He did not soften a single syllable. When he finished, applause began outside the abbey and rolled inward like a wave. It is one of the few times in recorded history that mourners have applauded inside a church during a funeral service. And then Charles Spencer went home to Northamptonshire, to Althorpe, the Spencer family estate where Diana grew up and where, by his decision, she is now buried on a small island in the middle of a lake, and he essentially disappeared from public life. That is the version of him the world knows. 1 moment, 8 minutes, then silence. But here is what the silence actually represents. Since 1997, the Diana media industry has generated billions in revenue. Books, documentaries, museum exhibitions, dramatizations, authorized biographies, unauthorized biographies, collector's editions, auction lots, anniversary specials. Diana's face has appeared on magazine covers annually for nearly 30 years. Her recorded voice has been played in countless documentary films. Her personal letters have been analyzed by strangers on television panels. Through all of it, Charles Spencer has sat at Althorpe with a vault that the rest of the world would consider extraordinary. Home movies of Diana as a child, her private diaries written in her own hand, personal photographs taken within the family, never sold, never licensed, never released. The private Diana, unposed, unperformed, fully human, exists in those materials. And she exists only there because Charles Spencer has never once allowed any of it out into the world. He has turned down every network, every publisher, every production company, reportedly every approach that has ever been made. Not one frame of unseen footage, not one page from the diaries. The publicly available documentary record of Diana, as vast as it is built entirely from material the whole world already had. Charles Spencer has contributed nothing to it, and he has done so by design. Ask yourself what it takes to maintain that position for 28 years while the commercial appetite for your sister's story never diminishes. Ask yourself what kind of conviction, or what kind of guilt, keeps a man at that post through every wave of anniversaries and milestones and major royal events. Because it is not simply principle, it is something deeper and more painful than that. And to understand what it is, you need to know the part of this story that most coverage quietly passes over. In 2021, Lord Dyson, a former master of the rolls, published a review commissioned by the BBC into the circumstances surrounding the 1995 Panorama interview in which Diana spoke to journalist Martin Bashir about her marriage, her mental health, and the royal family. That interview was watched by over 23 million people in the United Kingdom alone. It remains one of the most significant pieces of television journalism in British history. The Dyson Review found that Bashir had used forged documents to gain access to Diana, fabricated bank statements, fake evidence of surveillance, manufactured paperwork designed to convince an already vulnerable and isolated woman that people around her were betraying her, monitoring her, conspiring against her, and that her only safe course of action was to speak directly to the public through him. The interview was not a spontaneous act of courage on Diana's part. It was, at least in significant measure, the product of a calculated manipulation of her psychological vulnerabilities. When the full findings became public, something that had been privately known for some time inside the Spencer family was confirmed in the starkest possible terms. By multiple accounts, it was Charles Spencer himself who had first connected his sister to Martin Bashir. He had made an introduction, in good faith, to someone he had no reason to distrust. And that introduction, through a chain of events he could not have foreseen, had led directly to one of the most damaging experiences of his sister's life. Think about what that knowledge does to a person over time. You stood in the most famous church in England and told 2 billion people that you would protect Diana's sons, that her blood family would never allow the institution to consume them. And you carry simultaneously the knowledge that the single most psychologically exploitative media event in her lifetime walked through a door that you opened. That is not guilt in any casual sense. That is the kind of guilt that restructures a person. It informs every decision, colors every refusal, quietly shapes every year that follows. The sealed archives at Althorpe are not simply the choice of a private man who values discretion. They are, by every available account, an act of sustained atonement. A pledge that he will never again, however indirectly, be the mechanism by which his sister's vulnerability becomes content. No journalist gets in. No network gets access. No project, however well-intentioned it presents itself, touches the vault. Because the last project that came with compelling credentials and credible people attached turned his sister's fear into a television event watched by a nation. Now place this context around everything that has unfolded between Kensington Palace and Montecito over the past several years. Charles Spencer watched. He did not speak publicly, but he watched. He was reportedly present at the 2018 royal wedding celebrations when Meghan Markle arrived at the evening reception wearing Diana's aquamarine ring, a pale blue stone, photographed thousands of times during Diana's lifetime, immediately recognizable to anyone who had ever followed her story. In isolation, that moment may well have felt like genuine tribute. Diana's ring on the hand of the woman her son loved, on the most significant night of her son's adult life. A gesture of inclusion and remembrance. It was received warmly by most observers. But it did not stop there. Over the following years, items that had belonged to Diana appeared on Meghan at a frequency and in circumstances that began to constitute a pattern. Diana's butterfly earrings, a Cartier watch, gold bracelets, Each appearance came at a major public event, a guaranteed press moment, maximum camera coverage. Each one generated the same cycle: immediate recognition from royal watchers, widespread media coverage, emotional response from people who had loved Diana. Now, one can argue sincerely that the intentions behind each of these choices were entirely honorable. Grief inside families produces unexpected rituals of remembrance. Meghan had married into one of the most emotionally complex family situations imaginable. Wearing Diana's jewelry may have been her way of feeling connected to a woman she never met, but whose shadow was everywhere in her husband's life. That is a legitimate reading. But the question that reportedly began forming in Charles Spencer's mind, and in the minds of others watching closely, was simpler and less emotionally generous. There is a difference between tribute and pattern. Tribute is something you do once, twice at most. A pattern is a strategy, and when every single instance is tied to a moment of guaranteed maximum photography, that pattern starts to look less like private devotion and more like calculated brand positioning. Diana's memory, in other words, was being used as reflected light, and no one had called Althorp to ask. Then came March 2021, the Oprah Winfrey interview. If the jewelry had raised questions, this interview reportedly answered them with something close to finality, at least in Charles Spencer's private assessment. The interview was a masterwork of staging soft lighting, intimate setting, a single sympathetic interviewer, a royal wife speaking of institutional cruelty, and a system that had denied her mental health support and left her with no one to turn to except the public. If you knew the 1995 Panorama interview well, and Charles Spencer knew it better than almost anyone alive, the structural similarities were impossible to miss. They were not vague echoes. They were near identical. One woman, one sympathetic interviewer, one faceless institution that had failed her, the sense of secrets finally escaping. The suggestion that the interview itself was an act of necessary self-preservation. The one element that was different between the two interviews is the one that mattered most. Diana spoke to Martin Bashir in 1995 while trapped inside a royal system she could not exit, with everything to lose and nowhere to turn. The 2021 interview was filmed in California. After the exit, with production infrastructure attached and commercial arrangements already in place, the original was, whatever else you say about it, a desperate act. The sequel was a launch, and a man who has spent nearly 3 decades keeping that original exploitation from happening again reportedly did not experience watching it as anything other than an alarm. Against this backdrop, the watched pattern, the panorama echo, the sustained use of Diana's image without a single conversation with the person who actually controls Diana's legacy in early 2026, a proposal reportedly landed at Althorp. It came attached to significant names: Netflix, the production involvement of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. The occasion was the upcoming 30th anniversary of Diana's death in August 2027, a milestone that any honest observer would acknowledge carries genuine emotional and historical weight. On the surface, the proposal was for what it claimed to be, a documentary film about Diana, fronted by her son, for the most significant anniversary since the 1-year mark. The reported ask, however, was not surface level. They wanted Althorp itself as a filming location, the childhood home, the grounds, the lake, the island where Diana is buried. They reportedly wanted access to the private family archives, the photographs, the personal effects, the materials that have never left the estate. They reportedly wanted Diana's handwritten diaries, pages she wrote for herself, for no audience, in the private language of her own thoughts. They wanted the home movie's unguarded footage of Diana as a young woman, as a girl, in moments that have never been witnessed by anyone outside the Spencer family. Without those materials, this would be one more documentary built from the same recycled archive every other filmmaker has used for 30 years. With them, it would be something categorically different. It would be the definitive portrait of Diana that no one has ever been able to make, because the man who holds the only materials that could make it has never agreed to it. And then there was the framing. The proposal reportedly called for an explicit and sustained comparison between Diana's experience inside the royal institution and Meghan's experience inside the same institution. The two stories were to be positioned as continuous one woman, two generations, the same forces, the same silencing. Diana's struggle was to be presented as the historical foundation of Meghan's struggle. Her halo, essentially, was to be transferred, formally, in a major Netflix production. On the 30th anniversary of her death, Charles Spencer read the proposal, set it down, and reportedly replied with exactly 4 words. Is this a joke? Those 4 words have been described by people close to the situation as the most restrained version of what Spencer actually thought. They were not contempt for the cameras. They were not the reflexive reaction of a man who dislikes modern media on principle. They were the response of someone who has spent 28 years understanding exactly what it looks like when his sister's suffering is being turned into a product, and who was looking at the most elaborate version of it he had ever seen. To understand why this documentary proposal was not simply one project among many for the Sussex operation, you need to understand the state of their media enterprise in early 2026. The 5-year Netflix arrangement, which had been one of the most talked about deals in the entertainment industry when it was announced, was approaching its expiration point. The flagship original content produced under that arrangement had received a reception that can be politely described as uneven. A lifestyle series fronted by Meghan had drawn reviews ranging from mildly positive to scathing, with the critical consensus settling around a sense that the audience being targeted was not responding. When reviewers across the entire political and cultural spectrum of British media converged on similar language, and they did, from tabloids to broadsheets, from royalist publications to Republican ones, that convergence tells you something more fundamental than that a few critics disliked a television show. It tells you that the product itself is struggling to find its footing. The pattern in their audience numbers made the situation even clearer. Their debut documentary, the one that unpacked their departure from royal life, drew enormous viewership. The subsequent projects drew progressively less. The audience, when given the chance to vote with their attention, said with great consistency that they were interested in the royal dimension of the Sussex story and not particularly interested in what replaced it. The data pointed somewhere uncomfortable but unmistakable. The only Sussex content that generates genuine mass interest is content connected to the crown, to the family, to the palace. And the most powerful version of that content, the version that would outperform everything else they had ever made, would be content connected to Diana. She is the one card in the deck that is guaranteed to draw an audience of tens of millions, not because of the Sussexes, because of her. And the proposal for the 30th anniversary documentary was, underneath all its stated intentions, a recognition of exactly that fact. It was not a passion project. It was a survival strategy. The most financially critical content they could produce, dressed in the most emotionally compelling wrapping available. Charles Spencer saw the wrapping. He also saw what was underneath it. Here is where the story takes its most significant and least reported turn. Having declined the proposal, Spencer did not simply go back to his habitual silence. By accounts emerging from people close to the situation, he took a step that represents a profound shift in how he views this family conflict and his role within it. He reportedly wrote to Prince William, not to discuss reconciliation, not to broker peace. The letter, by all accounts, was strategic in its intent. Spencer reportedly urged the future king to break his prolonged public silence on the subject of Harry and the Sussex operation, not out of brotherly love, but out of something closer to institutional necessity. The argument, as it has been described, went something like this. The royal family's posture of complete indifference toward Harry and Meghan has not made the story go away. It has, if anything, handed the Sussexes an uncontested platform. When one side of a public conflict is entirely silent and the other is continuously producing content, the content wins the narrative. The audience does not experience silence as dignity, it experiences it as absence. And into that absence, the Sussex version of events fills every available space. Spencer reportedly told William that this cannot continue indefinitely. That the global perception of Harry as a figure increasingly defined by his wife's projects rather than his own identity is damaging not only to Harry personally, but to the broader story of what the monarchy represents. That the silence from Kensington Palace and Buckingham Palace, while understandable as a refusal to engage, has functional consequences that need to be weighed. This is a striking development for one specific reason that tends to get buried in the broader drama. Charles Spencer stood in Westminster Abbey in 1997 and directly challenged the Windsor family on behalf of his sister. He made a promise to protect her sons from the system that he believed had crushed her. And now, nearly 30 years later, that same man is reportedly urging the future head of that system to be more assertive in defending its public, standing against one of those very sons. If you want a single data point that measures how completely the loyalties within this extended family have shifted, that is it. Diana's brother is no longer the adversary of the institution. He has become, at least in this instance, something closer to its concerned ally. The fracture within the family itself has not shown any sign of healing. People close to the palace have consistently described the core issue as one of trust, or rather the complete absence of it. The specific fear, as it has been reported, is not of